When you're ready. Quando você está pronto.
Okay, just let me see if the guy in Brazil manages to get your link to broadcast it through our YouTube channel also. Just 1 minute.
Oh, hello. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Sim, Felipe? Diga, tá tudo ok? Pode passar? Pode passar. Okay, we can start. Okay, thank you all for being here. This is a long project, started in 2004, so 20 years on the road. This is the fourth stage of this 20-year period. It is the most recent. We have started in 2004, as I said, in Angola, with a big international conference. This project was supposed to be a participatory action research project, meaning a platform or an arena to bring together the academies, civil society organizations, activists, journalists, politicians, both from the government and the opposition, the government members, the international community, trade unions, and churches. And that's what we've been doing since then, with myriad international conferences in Angola, in the provinces of Angola, in Maputo, Mozambique, in Brazil, in Portugal, in Brussels, at the European Parliament, at the United Nations, Wageningen, SOAS, and now it's a pleasure to be here at King's to present this latest book. This is the 8th of this project, with several other scientific reports that we have published. We usually send invitations to all our researchers for them to publish, and this time, and for this specific stage of the project, we had 3 publications. This is the second. We still have one to go early next year, specifically on the data treatment of the inquiries that we applied in Angola and Mozambique. We applied 2,000 questionnaires in Angola, 2,000 in Mozambique, in each and every of the 11 provinces of Mozambique, each and every 18 provinces of Angola. It was a major work that started, this stage started in 2018, and is now coming to an end with the publications. It was a very hard work, as you can imagine, a lot of logistic, financial, political problems as we deal with politically sensitive issues, of course, and to be in Angola and in Mozambique to do a work like this, and to bring people from all the spectrum of political parties and activists and youngsters that are usually unheard and marginalized, as in Angola and Mozambique, and have all these movements, and we brought them to our conferences together with members of parliament, members of the opposition, members of the international community. So Basically, it's our purpose to have an open space for discussion, and I think we've been quite successful all these years in doing that, with a lot of problems still, but we've been able to be here and to have our publications, and it's work of 20 years so far. So Justino Pinto Andrade from the Angolan Catholic University started this project with me 20 years ago, and we are still together and we are still working. Nowadays, he's a member of parliament representing a party of the opposition, but still he's still involved in our project, in our conferences and our publications. So 3 volumes, 3 books to be published at this stage. The first was to gather all the authors that wanted to publish in Portuguese. The second one was for the authors who wanted to publish in English, and the third one will deal specifically with the statistics of those 4,000 questionnaires that were applied. 6 pages per questionnaire. As you can imagine, it was a big logistics that it would not be possible without our partners in civil society, be it in Angola, be it in Mozambique. In Angola, the Center for Integrity, and in Angola, the MUDE movement, the civic movement, MUDE, with all those their networks in the field. So a very difficult task. We managed to apply the questionnaires even in the northern provinces of Mozambique with ISIS acting in several locations. Myriad problems to apply those questionnaires, but still we managed to do it. And so the results are coming out, and the final book will come out in the first trimester of 2025. So once again, thank you for the authors that were able to be here. Luca was not able to be, but anyway, we have this table to discuss publicly these specific chapters that we published in this book. So I will probably start with 6-7 minutes to each of the authors to present the main ideas of their papers, and then open the discussion to the discussants that are one in Mozambique and the other in Angola. I guess, are they, Toby?
I discussed that Elsa is certainly there. I can see Elsa, Elsa. But Federico doesn't seem to have joined yet.
Okay.
Elsa is in Benguela.
In Benguela, in Angola. Okay, so we start with Melin, then Henning, and then we move on with myself, my own paper, then David Sogi and Bob, and then Bruno Costa. Okay, thank you. Melin, please.
Thank you very much, Nuno. I'd like, first of all, to pay a tribute to Nuno, who has worked tirelessly over a period of 20 years so that the people of Angola and Mozambique can have freedom to tell their own stories outside the parameters of the official narrative of ruling parties. Nuno's supervisor at King's was Patrick Chabal. In his seminal work, Africa Works, Patrick set out to explain aspects of African politics which other commentators had willfully ignored. He tried to explain why so much of sub-Saharan Africa remained poor in spite of the rich resources of the continent. And he linked his explanation to another question which still remains relevant today. What is the reason for the high level of social violence in Africa, tipping over into sometimes into civil war and genocide? From there, he moved on to critique a whole range of issues associated with economic development and aid. His answers were relatively straightforward. Political culture in Africa had its roots in the pre-colonial era, and was built on the practices of patrimonialism. He explained in detail how the elites of Africa made social violence and disorder work to their advantage and were able to use foreign investment and development aid as an income stream to support their patrimonial networks. My chapter aims to show how Portuguese colonial rule, using Patrick's analysis, was changed after independence into the rule of a narrow political elite, which had its cultural roots in the Portuguese colonial past. In Angola, the MPLA leadership was drawn from the Creole families of Luanda and Benguela, who had lost status during the years of white immigration. For them, the independence and the party, MPLA, offered a route back to enjoying the status which they considered to be their due. Both Frelimo and MPLA asserted that their right to rule was based on victory in the independence wars. It was a revolutionary, not a democratic mandate. There were no elections or referenda to establish their legitimacy. This lack of any popular endorsement would slowly undermine the legitimacy of the ruling parties and would deepen the divisions during the civil wars that followed. Later, the holding of regular elections were manipulated to secure the victory of the ruling parties. And the recent elections in Mozambique this year would not have surprised Patrick Chabal. Elections are held in Mozambique and Angola, not so much to give the people a voice, and certainly not to hold the government to account, but to dress the rulers' patrimonialism in internationally acceptable democratic clothing. In Angola, after independence, little attempt was made to implement any leftist policies, and the party became wholly concerned with balancing the pressures of their rival international sponsors, the Soviet Union and the Cubans. This led in 1977 to the so-called Nito Alves conspiracy and the subsequent purges in which tens of thousands of Angolans are believed to have been massacred. In Mozambique, Frelimo rounded up large numbers of its opponents and held show trials. A year after independence, the leading figures who had been opposed to Frelimo were all murdered. The development policies of the late colonial period, concessions to favorite foreign investors, and above all, the dam projects, deeply influenced the long-term thinking of the post-independence regimes. Frelimo adopted the policies of the former colonial government towards dams on the Zambezi. Having denounced the Cahora Bassa Dam and claimed that it was the tool of colonialism and capitalism, they now plan to build a third and even a fourth dam, which would sell electricity to South Africa. These are capital projects that have resulted in forced relocations of the population. These projects enable Frelimo to represent itself as a modernizing party, reflecting very much the modernity of the late colonial period. And there have been similar capital projects in Angola aimed at very much the same objectives. Between 1980 and 1990, both Angola and Mozambique became victims of the destabilization policies of South Africa. The state of war enabled Frelimo and MPLA to consolidate their position as one-party rulers by delegitimizing any opposition movement, while the South African aggression helped to hide the fact that the civil wars were in part an expression of the hostility of the populations to the policies of the ruling elite. The changing world order in the 1990s sought to align Africa with the values and practices of the Washington Consensus. However, these were rejected out of hand in Angola, whose oil wealth enabled the government to ignore such international pressures. And with the development of natural gas in Mozambique, Mozambique is heading the same way. When it became known in 2016 that members of Mozambique's political elite had secretly negotiated huge loans, bypassing all official parliamentary controls, the extent of Mozambique's alignment with the financial practices of Eduardo dos Santos in Angola became fully apparent. Patrick Chabal pointed out that Africa is not poor, and the story since independence has been largely determined by what African elites have chosen to do with their resource riches, what their social and political priorities have been. Norway began to exploit its oil reserves at approximately the same time as Angola, and Norway has always ranked at the top, either in first or second place, of the Human Resources Index. There is no reason, apart from a difference in political culture, why Angola should not also rank among the first nations in the world in terms of human welfare. Both Mozambique and Angola have established ruling parties that operate a refined form of patrimonialism, which has made their ruling elites among the richest men in Africa, while the populations of their countries remain among the poorest, and the countries themselves near the bottom of the Human Development Index. There is an alternative, and I would like to just say that if you think that Mozambique and Angola could not have gone in a different direction, that somehow they were predetermined to follow the trajectory that they have done, take a look at Cabo Verde, the poorest country probably in the world in terms of resources, and what it has been able to achieve in terms of human welfare through the use of international aid and through good government. And I think the contrast should always be in people's minds when they discuss what has happened in Angola and Mozambique.
Please.
My task is to present a short, concise overview on the trends in the Southern African region. And given the extreme tight time limit, I will read it out. The last half of a century marked significant changes in the Southern African region. The seizure of political power by former liberation movements in Angola and Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, Namibia, and South Africa was misunderstood by these as the end of history, meaning they would continue to remain in power and control over the state until eternity. Or, as a popular slogan suggests, until the return of Jesus Christ. But times are changing, and with them demographic shifts in the electorate. Struggle veterans retire, and control over the commanding heights of state power is increasingly dwindling. We know that the rule of ZANU-PF has since the turn of the century been based on rigged elections and brutal repression. Government survived thanks also to the support by other SADC states. We also observed that the hegemonic status of the MPLA and the Frelimo in differing degrees waned. The current civil war-like process in Mozambique speak for themselves. All these signs of deterioration are not anything new. Observing decolonization during the late 1950s in West Africa, Frantz Fanon created with The Wretched of the Earth an enduring legacy. In a chapter on the pitfalls of national consciousness, he bemoans that the sovereign state foists itself on the people. It mistreats, intimidates, and harasses, to remind them constantly that the government expects from them obedience and discipline. For Fanon, the self-declared liberators became the new oppressors. Fanon's analysis gained new relevance and attraction witnessing governance by former liberation movements in Southern Africa. As observed by Imran Bukus, I quote, "A good number degenerated into the sort of rapacious kleptocracies famously described by Fanon." End of the quote. This went hand in hand with an authoritarian mentality crafted and internalized during the so-called struggle days. Based on his own experiences and insights in the struggle for independence in Angola, Arthur Carlos Mauricio Pestana dos Santos, who publishes under his former nom de guerre Pepetela, described this in his novel Mayombe. It is one of the early and most sensible revelations unmasking the emerging power structures. In a revealing dialogue, the commander of the guerrilla unit, Sem Medo, meaning fearless, explains to the political commissioner Mundo Novo, meaning new world, I quote, "We don't share the same ideals. You are the machine type, one of those who are going to set up the unique, all-powerful party in Angola. I am the type who could never belong to the machine. What I want you to understand, the revolution we are making is half the revolution I want." End of the quote. Struggle mentalities continue to unfold after the end of colonial and white minority rule. They were manifest in authoritarian mindsets. In the end, the transition of former liberation movements into political parties has not led to good governance. As an editorial of the Namibian newspaper Namibian Sun diagnosed in June 2023, I quote, "Even a cursory look at the former liberation movements that eventually ascended to political power in Southern Africa reveals their evolution into parties that have vacuumed resources meant for the benefit of the poor and still disadvantaged." End of the quote. The equation that the party is the government and the government is the state has contributed to troubled democratic transitions. Not least the born free, not any longer obliged to be loyal to the governing party, having been liberated from a colonial yoke, respond with frustration to the shattered illusions of the post-liberation state. William Gumede presents a long list of failures. It includes one-partyism, ethnic politics, leadership cult, party-state fusion, political intolerance, culture of secrecy, cult of violence, permanent entitlement, and moral bankruptcy. As he concludes, I quote, "African independence and liberation movements turned governments have often become obstacles to building lasting democracies." End of the quote. The anatomy of party and state testifies to a specific constellation characteristic under former liberation movements as governments. Their rule is rooted in and impregnated by using force to overthrow undemocratic, repressive regimes under colonialism. The internalized dispositions were hardly favorable for the creation and durable strengthening of human rights, civil liberties, and democratic norms. Any opposition to them and their rule was viewed by those in power with suspicion and risked oppression. Often sacrificing their own humanity, members of liberation movements replaced degrading systems of racist minority rule based on totalitarian practices and exploitation. What remains is unfinished business. After all, independence without a firm basis for democracy, human rights, and collective as well as individual well-being, also in terms of material security, is still far from being liberation. Despite such sobering track record, one should, however, also reflect what the alternative might have been. Fighting settler colonial regimes came with a high price, not only in terms of human sacrifices, but also of sacrificing humanness and humanity. But continued settler colonial rule from Algeria and Angola to Zimbabwe would most likely have not been a better alternative. After all, the right to self-determination and, if only formal, civil rights for the ordinary people remain achievements, even if they are in reality a far cry from human dignity for all. The ruling elites originating from former liberation movements have demonstrated that they are less interested in democracy than they are in pursuing their self-interest and retention of power. This includes the willingness to sacrifice the constitutionalism they claim to have been fighting for. The rule of law has in some of these states turned into the law of the rulers. Current popular protests in Mozambique are the point of departure for the continued relevance of the slogan that the struggle continues. Unfortunately, and sadly so, a luta continua translated into the looting continues. Given the socio-economic and political realities, liberation movements as governments cannot any longer expect loyalty based on their cultivation of a heroic narrative which claims they liberated the people and therefore these owe them support. As governing parties, they are measured against the delivery in office. It's the result of the governance that matters, not any struggle credentials. We have just witnessed the willingness of the ANC to recognize and respect the will of the electorate. This sets a new standard. Guided by a democratic system based on the rule of law and the protection of the constitutional principles, irrespective of significant ideological differences in a government of so-called national unity, is setting a new agenda. The attempt to transform a former liberation movement into a democratic political party might provide an avenue to the benefit of most citizens as a step forward in dealing with unfinished business. Similarly, the graceful acceptance of defeat by the party governing Botswana since independence sets a new example contrasting with Frelimo's willingness to risk civil war. It remains to be seen what situation unfolds in Namibia after the elections that just took place in late November. But it is more than ever obvious that after 50 years of transitions in Southern Africa, there are considerable development challenges ahead.
Thank you, Henry. David.
It's Nuno. Before I begin, I feel I ought to take just a minute to explain why we are here as not part of the academy. We are independent scholars, although with a certain track record. Bob is a published anthropologist who lived in one of the Museks in Rwanda in the 1990s, and I've been visiting Angola for assorted assignments within the foreign aid world since 1985 or so. So that's a bit of background. We are independent, but we're also dependent on the real thing, on scholars like yourselves. So we're grateful for that and grateful for this opportunity to learn more about your project, P-DEIAM. Not long after it began, Bob in 2006 helped bring about the publication of one of your early books under the auspices of the Netherlands Institute of Southern Africa, which Bob is the director, in the 2000.
Long time.
Long time ago.
Long time.
So here we are again, and once again, I want to express our gratitude to have been invited. About our motivations, perhaps it speaks for itself, that our connections and our acquaintance with Angola and with Mozambique can be traced to activities of engagement against apartheid and for the states on the so-called front line already in the 1970s. So that's a bit of background about us. About our chapter, our opening paragraph in the book's chapter says, we reflect critically on our earlier observations, consider today's realities, and we conclude with a look ahead. So those are the three parts I want to now address. First, the retrospective. In earlier contributions, we saw Angola within a configuration of nested arenas, that is, spheres of relational and discursive power, economic, military, political, social. Most with major, but some with minor transnational dimensions. It's this transnational dimension that our chapter has tried to address. So we saw many good reasons to take these external factors seriously in discussing what domestic Angolan politics does and does not deliver, such as a robust social contract. We saw at the same time, and we could be accused, and I've heard it in the air, that taking that approach to what the outsiders are doing denies Africans of their own agency and their own organizations. That's definitely not what we are about in our paper. The accent, however, is on the external dimensions of those internal responses. Current perspectives. In this second part of the chapter, we note intensified transnational struggles around energy security. Mr. Biden, as you have seen, has just paid a visit to Angola precisely under the banner of energy security for his country and perhaps for others. Now, that's in the past been defined in terms of access to hydrocarbons and to the rents that those hydrocarbons yield. We note in this middle part of the chapter that the post-Santos government's rapid adoption of yet more measures to assure foreign interests and their domestic partners of their access to those rents is outstanding. It's become visible, and we note some examples of those new laws and institutions. This is all to the rising satisfaction of the IMF and the interests that it promotes. However, puncturing the complacency among domestic and foreign elites have come some hard-hitting exposés, sometimes through spectacular leaks of data files, and sometimes just through systematic digging by investigative journalists, often abetted by civil society bodies that operate through transnational alliances. And then in concluding this subsection of our paper, we rapidly note some examples of rural and urban initiatives in the name of development that commonly involve Western agencies or their ideas. We should have also mentioned the Chinese and their building programs. However, on most fronts, there is little to cheer about in these initiatives. The third part of our paper looks ahead. And there we see some encouraging expressions of civic activism. And we think the books that have come out have pinpointed a number of these, and the new one coming out next year may do the same to a greater degree. These expressions of civic activism have possibly knock-on effects in formal political life. An example is the MPLA's poor showing in the 2022 elections, especially in Luanda. Investments and experiments in public welfare do appear occasionally. They are led often, not always, often by foreign agencies, and therefore usually on a relatively microscopic scale, excuse me, and delinked from notions of welfare and public services as rights, as entitlements. And that lack of a linkage to politics means that the motivation of citizen interest in those defending and fighting for those rights can be very weak, if not dead on arrival. Finally, and we failed to notice that in our earlier contributions, I have to say. Finally, Angola finds itself once again on a front line, that of encroaching drought and other damage brought on by the very hydrocarbon economy and the arguments for energy security that have shaped that power, wealth, and real security for the past 6 decades. To conclude, in almost all of these nested arenas, including climate and ecosystems, which in our earlier contributions to the project we overlooked, we failed to mention, now that we're really standing out. In this circumstance, Angolan citizens face a host of wicked problems, that is, ones that resist simple resolution. External actors and agencies, the most powerful of which help reproduce and amplify those wicked problems, seems to us have special responsibilities to work with those Angolans, insisting on a change of course. That, in brief, is an overview of our chapter.
Thank you. Well, okay.
Yeah, I should have said that. We agreed to.
Okay. So, Bruno, please.
Thank you very much, Nuno, for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. My chapter is a more broader analysis dealing with the two main concepts, populism and authoritarianism, and the possible use of these concepts that were built in a Eurocentric perspective in other regions. So making this assumption already. So the idea is how we can use these concepts in the Southern Hemisphere without rebuilding, reconstruction, reformulating these concepts using precisely another point of views and another contributes, and dealing also with historical, economic, social, cultural impact in these countries, in these regions. Of course, the construction and consolidation of these concepts takes place with the exercise of power in the Western world. We are using concepts, visions, also with dealing with the democratic perspective, always dealing with this Western world perspective. However, there is a specific space when we talk about populism and authoritarianism and the attempt to apply these concepts in different regions, not only in Southern Hemisphere, but any other region besides the Western world. So this chapter focuses on the main studies on this discussion focus on three perspectives. The theoretical perspectives on models of exercising political power, the practical dimension in a process of specific characterization of models of governance, and the third dimension related with the comparative aspect, how to compare what is not meant to be compared. Sometimes when we are dealing with, for example, ratings of democracy, we are comparing very different realities. And it's not surprisingly that the most democratic realities are founded in these ratings in the Northern Hemisphere, mainly in the European Nordic countries, and of course, the less democratic countries are found in the Southern Hemisphere. So this study follows a cross-cutting question. Has democracy reached its peak as far as the number of countries is concerned? Yes, if we are dealing with this kind of classifications. We have clearly a peak of number of countries that are considered flawless democracies, and the sustained growth of populist movements, decreasing the level of democracies in other regions. Maybe the answer is that these movements, the populist movements and leaders, are understanding the needs of the population in a better way than the traditional political parties. At the same time, these movements are more eager to use social media and digital platforms to directly connect with citizens. So we go back to the idea of direct democracy that we found in ancient Greece. Besides, of course, we do not have democracy in ancient Greece. We have a kind of democracy considering all the exclusions. So we see the populist movement rising mainly, in my opinion, due to three factors: economic and social conditions, political polarization of the society, and the direct communication through the digital platforms. At the same time, we can observe an erosion of the democratic arrangement in several societies. Again, an erosion of the democratic Western society arrangement in several societies. So, what I try to not to answer, because it's very difficult to answer in such a short essay, but what I try to contribute is the answer to this main question: if populism could be a path to the emergence and consolidation of authoritarian regimes. And in this chapter, I focus on the traditional concept of populism as a thin ideology, mainly focus on the division between the people and the corrupt elite. So adopting the perception and the contribute of Casmud, mainly because the term populism is traditionally associated with a negative tone. And indeed, that wasn't always the case. Before, we saw a symbiosis between political actors and their fellow citizens. So populism was mainly the idea of a struggle between different groups of the society to avoid what we call the concentration of powers. More recently, this fight is against the consequences of certain levels of capitalism and globalization. So many times, populism is saw alongside the idea of nationalism and protectionism. So we face the existence of a polysemic concept with a variety of possible uses. However, the main division is still very updated. The us versus them, with a clear identification of an enemy. Around the world, we can find fertile ground to the spread of populist ideas, mainly with this perspective: a robust central context or a robust government authority in substitution of a consensus solutions. So many times populism tries to appear as a cover for a false appearance of democracy. Indeed, populism is being used both to consolidate a regime and to change it. So contributing to maintain a status quo, contributing to use a systemic challenge in different societies. However, what we saw is that we have a full capacity of populist leaders to play the democratic game and with the democratic rules, gaining some efforts to play in this context. That's why the analysis of populism and authoritarianism in the Southern Hemisphere need to be done with a new set of values, concepts, and elements. Addressing the African, the South American, or the Southeast Asian context requires a long process of recourse to historical, social, cultural contributions in order to understand how power was institutionalized in this region and how the colonial period affect the implementation of these values and these political systems in this region. For example, not only the historical background, but all the economic and social inequalities, all the internal factors as religions or ethnical issues, holding external influence and pressure, dealing, for example, some of these examples, the diplomatic influence of France, the military influence of Russia, the economic influence of China, and how this is affecting the process to implement secure democracies in these regions. Indeed, however, it's possible to find similar trends or topics when addressing the populist movement in the Southern Hemisphere. For example, the maintenance of an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist discourse, the defense of a process of autonomization of these states in the framework of international relations. They have their own voice, as well as their respective position in positions of political leadership in international organizations. The existence of strong economic and social disparities in society, the permanence of ethnic divisions, the increased use of alternative media, particularly in the Latin American context, or the preponderance of charisma in the analysis of political leaderships and the challenge posed to separation of powers in some of the constitutional, institutional aspects that we saw. For example, in the Lusophone world, we saw the mummification of the Portuguese constitution in Cabo Verde, in Guinea-Bissau, however, without taking in consideration the specificities of these countries and the specificities of these realities. So it was a contribution that was made mainly by law specialists, Portuguese law specialists, that mainly dictate the constitutional archetype in these regions. And of course, in countries with weakened or fragile regimes, movements tend to take advantage of this weakness. So we saw the fuel or the ground in order to implement a political structure that are against the idea of a democratic society, considering the democratic values implemented in the Western world during the 20th century. According to specific contexts, we saw an attraction for populism based on authoritarianism and the development of revolutions or coups as a means of achieving power is highlighted. For the next steps, for the next studies, I developed, or I used to try to answer to a simple question, not only dealing with the different indicators and the different index to measure democracy and quality of democracy, or to measure the quality of life standards, but if we should go to the basis, and if we should go to the redefine populism and authoritarianism concepts according to these realities, trying to give these realities a new perspective instead of an unfair comparative perspective that we are doing until this moment. Thank you very much.
Okay, we should have now Luca, but unfortunately he cannot participate, and he will bring us the specific case of Mozambique. So I will briefly present my chapter because we don't have much time. Well, my chapter is basically about the way this perspective is to show how this dominant perspective on the African political systems, and more specifically on Angola and Mozambique, do seem to acknowledge them as faulty replicas or faulty democracies or faulty socialism or whatever usually use as to characterize them, and instead to support the argument that most of these political systems, and specifically the Angolan and Mozambican, do have their own logics, do have their own purpose, and do follow their own specific endogenous projects, and usually they take the international tendencies of the moment in order to subdue them to the internal logics instead of the other way around. The first part of the chapter is to show that after the independence in both countries, and so in both cases, more in Angola than Mozambique, I try to show how we were dealing with some kind of a fake socialism that was completely distorted in favor of an internal right-wing logic inside the MPLA party, and how the whole system structures according its own logics and its own functioning, which we could call in neo-patrimonialism or postmodern patrimonialism, as I call it. And then how the transition period in the 90s was once again used and subverted to serve this internal logics, where all the main orientations or conditionalism that was imposed on them during that period was slowly, progressively distorted in favor of the same internal logics, in favor of the same power maintenance by the elites in power, which, by the way, have a long path in power in Angola and Mozambique. Most of these elites have come from very far from the colonial period. They structured even before that in Angola, and they have kept their power in different periods, in different vested ways, be it socialism, be it so-called social democracy, in the 90s being so-called capital liberalism. No matter what you call them, they have managed to follow their own agenda, their own purpose to stay in power, and they have managed very successfully to subvert the main international tendencies in their favor. They are still there. They went from so-called socialist nomenclature to the new capitalists during the transition period, and in the end the transition did not lead to anything like liberalism. So the privatization process was made in favor of this elite. The so-called civil society was subverted by them, with several civil society organizations sponsored and funded by the regimes themselves, while other that were originally from civil society were struggling with enormous difficulties, several of them to participate in this project. And so the openness to the opposition was also a facade. And once again, all these opposition parties do struggle with a lot of obstacles that are purposely created by these regimes. And one main tendency that we see in both cases is how these elites mimic and replicate the methods and the idea and the feeling of the colonial period, the despise for the people, the despise for the so-called l'Afrique inutile, those that do not matter from the center and from the elite's perspective and from their project of power maintenance, and how they replicate several of the methods to control the people and to keep them subdued. This is not to say that we have here the malefic elites against the poor people, the victims. Well, Pepetela, as you mentioned, he deals with that in that same book, Mayombe, where you can clearly see how several pressures for preferentialism, for clientelism, do come from from the guerrilleros and from those that came from the people. So the story is not that straightforward between bad elites and good peoples, but in any case, that's a pattern that we can see reproduced after independence, be it in the so-called socialist period, be it during the so-called transition. And the second part of the chapter deals exactly with this new tendency of populism, authoritarianism, and how it has been approached by these regimes and in what terms. And again, we can see a selective option of these regimes for some aspects of these new tendencies that do serve the same old purpose of keeping power, of controlling opposition movements, be it within civil society, be it within the opposition, lawfare, control of the media, control of the economy, be it the private sector, be it the public sector, and so on and so forth. And you can see all these methods that are now being made more legitimate by these new authoritarian tendencies. And so once again, we do not see an imposition or faulty replicas of these new tendencies in these regimes, but a selective option of a few aspects of these new tendencies in order to serve the same old political purpose of these elites, that is to reproduce their power, maintain their power through the acquisition of public resources that are deviated for these purposes, and keeping most of the people in dire poverty, and as Malin mentioned, in very good positions within the Human Development Index. And again, how these elections that started in the 90s have been regularly and with more refined and sophisticated techniques, they are being distorted, and how electoral integrity has been distorted in order to achieve the purpose of being kept in power under so-called legitimate elections that in the end are part of the new tendency of illiberal democracies, or whatever you might want to call it. And so I stay here, and let's move on to have the participation of the discussants. I don't know if they are online, Toby.
Yeah, Elsa is there.
And then we can open.
I think Pedrito has, I think he may have had some connection problems. He is in Vega, so he has sometimes had connection problems. Elsa, nos pode ouvir? Elsa.
Perfeitamente.
Muito bem. Bom, praça para você.
Hi everybody, my name is Elsa. I'm from Angola. I live in Bengala. I will speak slowly and I'll read what I have to say. I prefer to speak in Portuguese and in Spanish. I'm much more fluent, but I'll try to speak in English. So much has been said and described about our countries, especially Angola. Therefore, I prefer to talk about my perception as an Angolan in the light of what is described in the several chapters of the book. As an Angolan living in Angola, I was born 1 year after the independence. I see today a country characterized by the control of power by an elite, what is well described in the several chapters of the book, a new post-colonial elite who wants to remain in the power at all costs in order to guarantee and maintain the spoliation of the country as well. a country, we live in a country today with widespread corruption at all levels, in the presidential office, in a school, in a hospital. The corruption is widespread. It's like a disease without absolutely no control. We have serious limitations on civil liberties, pronounced inequalities in access, especially in wealth, education, just security, among others. One of the writers of the book speak about Pepetela Mayombe. I love Pepetela, and I recommend the book called in Portuguese Predadores. Because this book describes very, very, very well how the elites have created the mechanism for accumulating their wealth. So today we have an authoritarian party state system that does not respect the rights and freedoms of Angolans. A very important aspect to emphasize is the inhibition and almost complete lack of people's participation in decision-making process. For example, I gave only 2 examples. There are many examples. One of the examples I could give you is the change of our constitution in 2010. Which led to a total concentration in power in the hands of the president. Was being said in that time, it was made a wide consultation with the population to know what they think about the new articles of the constitution. Everybody accepted is absolutely lie. It was made in an office with the same elite who rules the country, and was imposed to the rest of us. More recently, we have the new political and administration division. We have 18 provinces, and they decide to divide and to make the country more organized and pass from 18 provinces to 21. The same narrative. No, we made a wide consultation with the people. A lie, absolutely lie. They divide the country to better control the votes in the next election, and we have to accept. So we have a government, a party state that lacks absolutely transparency, accountability. The electoral process is absolutely fraudulent, and we count with the absolute complicity of the rest of the world. I think is all I have to say in English. I would like to say much more, but in Portuguese is where I felt more comfortable to speak. So this is my contribution to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elsa. So, do we have Pedrito online? No,
he's not online.
He's not online. Okay. So, should we move on to the open floor discussion? Okay. Okay. So, please go ahead. Whoever wants to intervene, participate.
And I can handle.
Okay.
Yeah, to be honest, I do feel like we just keep restating the same points without actually critically analyzing the root causes on why there's so much rampant corruption in these countries. what is being said in a lot of these chapters is things that we already know and things that are very Eurocentric. I mean, you also mentioned the case of China and how China has these buildings that they're building and it's not really helping the local people. But I mean, China is there as a non-conditional actor and actually building infrastructure that has been because of the Western financial institutions leaving a vacuum, they're in now as a new actor and actually helping the people. I mean, arguably, you can go and research and make your own conclusions out of that. There's a lot on the whole Chinese involvement in Africa debate, but I think it's very Eurocentric and just very narrow-minded to just keep blaming African elites for the problems that Africa has, when also here in the West we've got the same problems that have been caused because of the capitalistic neoliberal system that governs the whole world. So I think that we cannot have the African discussion without looking at why this problem started anyways. I mean, it's very easy to just point fingers at Africa, but what about the UK? There's children living in poverty right now, but and we're in the West. I mean, shouldn't we be better off than them oftentimes? And I feel like instead of pointing fingers, we need to look at the West's responsibility in creating all of these problems. So yeah, so I think we should just know critical analysis of this problem and stuff. And I'm just
I fully understand what you're saying, and I also was feeling that you don't want to just denounce elites and so on without an analysis of what is going on underneath and why Africa may be different from other countries. All I can say is, do you know Patrick Chabal's book, Africa Works? It was written in 2002, no, 2000. So it's quite an old book, but it is a most penetrating analysis of why things in Africa are how they are. And I really do recommend that people go back to looking at Africa Works, because it explains so much of what is happening and what we're commenting on. And from an African point of view, he's not trying to impose European standards at all. He's trying to find out how Africa works. And I still think it's a key book to understand what we're talking about.
Yes, please. Go ahead. Well, thank you for your intervention. I think you were hitting the nail on its ugly head in a certain way. Friends of mine from Angola, Kiluanji, which is one of the Musex, told me straight away that in 3 years' time they had more benefits from what the Chinese did than what the Portuguese had done in how many years before. I think what is a problem here is we are sitting here and we came here from exactly the perspective that you say that our countries and our Western Hemisphere, Europe, let's say, I'm from Holland, from Amsterdam, are part and parcel of that colonial period. So we started all our kind of careers in an anti-colonial way, and fighting colonialism from within the Western countries, all of us. So I think the problem with us is that we take that analysis so for granted that we try to bring it further and then look in Angola, which is a long time favorite country of myself, and that we sometimes should go back and bring the overall analysis. I think Nuno did it in what he wrote because he shows how external influences are met by internal kind of influences, and I think that's the interesting part of what we're doing, how these are interlinked. Shortly. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So if I can just follow up from that. Carlos Lopes, who I'm sure it's a person you're well versed in the works, just published a book called Self-Deception. And in that book, he provided an interesting publication in that African leaders are actually accountable to, yeah, if it's of interest to you, is that African leaders are actually accountable to Western powers more than they are accountable to the electorate. So these conversations that we're having here and pointing the finger at those African elites, which I love to do, I spend a lot of time doing, a lot of my work does that, is half of that story, right? Because they are working for someone, right? And I think in the debate, what was missing is that big elephant in the room, right? That we are taking for granted, and there is also a very interesting book that I'd like to point you towards, called A Critique of Political Decolonization by Bernard Peugeot. He's just based at the University of Notre Dame. And in that book, he questions this very taking for granted that we do often, and that you do in your elaborations, that political independence was achieved in Africa. And I think the territorial independence is one thing, but then a reflection about, as a political action, what we accomplished in the 50s, 60s, much later in Lusophone Africa in the 70s, in what way was that decolonization? When we consider what was the day after independence, I mean, you mentioned Cape Verde, a negotiated transition to independence, right? A negotiation transition in those very political parties that we are talking about being a one-party state. Those models were imposed by those very countries that said, oh, time to go now, right? I mean, you know, Guinea-Bissau had to have an independence war, right? And these terms were negotiated, these terms were imposed. And we all know that one-party states were not only tolerated, but enabled by the Western agenda, because African states didn't just wake up the day after independence and have the funds to build a state, right? The Western agenda in international development was all about facilitating the state building process. And in that process, as we're talking about contingencies, there were rules about what is and isn't possible because those states didn't have any money, right? And so I think a lot of what we are discussing is a system that was enabled by a process. We look back the past 50, 60. Cape Verde has been independent for 50 years. We look back to 50 years of independence and we think, okay, to what extent what we are calling the political elites and the actions, to what extent is that just as a result of those political elites and their intentions? And I'm not the one who will defend the political elites, but I think the story is just a little bit more complicated than pointing the finger to those elites and because they are so corrupt, because we're a bit tired of the so corrupt conversation. Political elites are corrupt, but it's a little bit, and corruption is not done by one, it's a bit like marriage. It takes two to wreck a marriage, right? So I think considerations like that are very important. I thought that in 2024, comparing Norway with Angola, now with all due respect, is a bit rich. I think that when we talk about Cape Verde as being a good example for good governance, I always take that again. I'm Cape Verdean, by the way. Cape Verde is a country of 500,000 people, right? And you already know the history, I don't need to tell. Cape Verde is not Angola. Cape Verde was not Angola in the colonial times, right? It's a whole different state, a whole different context, and it's very unhelpful to compare Cape Verde with the rest of Africa, let alone with the rest of Lusophone Africa. But even if you want to talk about Cape Verde, it is the work I do. I mean, systematically, you look at a country that is considered as top 5 in Africa for good governance, undoubtedly, right? But I'm very convinced, and I think this conversation just convinced me even further, that I need to write a book about who this good governance is benefiting. Because Afrobarometer does review these surveys every year. Every year, Cape Verdeans tell you they are not happy. More than 70% of Cape Verdeans are unhappy about this so-called good governance. I talk to my auntie every year for Independence Day, and I tell her we have to celebrate. And she asks me, what has independence given me? And this is supposed to be the jewel of Africa when it comes to governance, because we are top 5, right? So at the end of the day, we know that the Cape Verdean model of governance and development, British tourists who go on holiday there, and for them that good governance is working. But for the Africans that have to live in those countries every day, I'm not sure that Cape Verde is an example, even if we just take the fact that it's a whole different country. So I thought we all agree on the problems. I don't think there is anything to disagree about what those political elites do, and the problems, they are all very obvious in this day and age. But the further layers of complication to these conversations is what I wanted us to reflect on as we're pointing the finger to those elites that we all agree, I think.
Okay, thank you so much for your intervention.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I just following on from the discussion in general. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about the theoretical framework here, because that to me was quite lacking in the conversation. I didn't. I mean, there's a lot of what was being discussed about populism, authoritarianism, elite capture, is frankly a description of the Western world in the last 30 years. You know, since under COVID, it became clear that the entire Western world is functioning as an illiberal democracy, not just Angola, but Mozambique.
Right.
And that these are problems. In fact, there's quite an interesting description of problems the world faces. I think, as I just said, none of us would disagree about that diagnosis. But I think the theorization needs to be broader. It needs to understand the way in which, in fact, this is not representing simply autonomous paradigms reproducing themselves. It's actually reproducing a framework of global capital expansion under globalization since the end of the Cold War, which has led to the collapse of liberal democracies around the world. I mean, the definition of populism, which was a good one, I think, which we're going to get into, the relationship between corrupt elites and the people. I mean, that is a definition of America at the moment. It's a definition, perhaps, of the Netherlands at the moment. It's a definition of a number of Western democracies. And so really, I think this has to be placed in a much broader framework than simply just to focus on Angola and Mozambique, in order to understand how these dynamics are actually playing out. And then, in terms of, there's quite a lot of focus on data. I mean, data is what sort of scientists work with, and we have to be aware of the fact that data are entirely unreliable. I mean, Cape Verde, for example, a lot of the real engine of the economic growth of Cape Verde in the last 30 years is not mentioned in any data because it's mostly illegal. Morton Jerden's book, Poor Numbers, tells us quite clearly that data is not to be trusted when we try and build these theorizations. So I think the theoretical framework behind a lot of the analysis was from these needs to attack.
Bruno, do you want to?
Yes, the Cape Verde is a very good example because, for example, the University of Cape Verde was built with Chinese money, and now the state is having the university with some difficulties to maintain the building with all the facilities that were built. That points me to a new question, that is, if we are not substituting the colonial concept with a post-colonial or a new colonial aspect dealing with economic purposes. So political leaders are not totally independent. The elites are not totally independent. They are answering to specific goals, not only of China, but also other Western countries. The main question here is that we are also comparing countries with 30, 40, 50 years of independence, considering the recognition in the United Nations, with countries and societies with 200, 100 years of independence. So when we try to compare levels of development, levels of satisfaction with political organization, this historical timeline, it's very important to keep in mind. Because, for example, for sure, the Portuguese people in the 70s had such different perspectives of democracy than the Portuguese nowadays. And we already saw a rise and fall of satisfaction with the democracy due to this analysis of capitalism, globalization, lack of answers of political elites to the basic needs of population. However, However, it's very important to keep in mind this global debate. We cannot do this debate without asking people, and I think that probably the third volume will help us contributing to the debate, asking people, asking civil society, asking organizations that are not committed with any kind of political party or any kind of political government, their perspective and their vision about the evolution of the democratic period in these countries. But more important than that, I focus on the need to bring the reconceptualization of these perspectives. Because, for example, for me, it's very easy as a Portuguese guy to define democracy. I know what is democracy for me. I was born after the April Revolution, so I was born in a democratic period. I benefit a lot from the European Union money, so the comparative is allowing Portugal to keep the track of the main European countries. However, in a huge difference, we are far away from the Netherlands, from the Nordic countries. But I'm not quite sure if this definition of democracy is still valid or it should be used to compare with other countries. I'm not only talking about only African countries, I'm talking about the 193 countries based in the United Nations. So probably we need to find, and for the first time when I try to present a specific work dealing with democratic comparative of the Lusophone countries in Colombia, I was completely demolished by the several speakers there, because they said, okay, your comparative work is well done, but you are using only the index and the indicators and the values that were developed by these several organizations based on the Northern Hemisphere. So it's easy to compare this way, and it is easy to present a very well-developed world against a less developed world. And this will lead us always to a mistake comparative analysis, in my opinion.
I accept your criticism that the theoretical view was lacking in our presentation that I gave verbally, but it's not lacking in our text. And the person that we tried to bring forward in this book, but also in earlier contributions to the project, is the ideas of the political economist Saskia Sassen. I don't know if you are acquainted with her work. She's focused on global issues of flows of resources, flows of money, and her concept of denationalized politics is one that we brought up in our paper. To put it in a very short and succinct and probably unfair framework, she's basically saying that the big institutions, the IMF and the Americans and so on, they are not so concerned about the Ministry of Agriculture in Angola or the Social Service Ministry. They're interested in the central bank and in the Ministry of Finance. And that pattern of zeroing in on key institutions is a way, she would say perhaps the way, in which this denationalized form of politics takes place in collaboration with outside powers. I'm not doing justice to her a much more sophisticated argument, but I would put her work forward as a useful source, certainly we find useful.
What she's effectively trying to do is to build on, let's say, the anti-imperialism kind of framework, and see how that worked out in this globalization time, where you can simply see, Mr. Biden is the living example of it. He just opened or was visiting the Lobito Corridor. If you know what the Lobito Corridor is, the Lobito Corridor is the Benguela Railroad as of 1902 and coming into effect in 1930. And why was that opened by the Belgians and the Portuguese and the English? Cecil John Rose, who was one of the people who was providing a capital for that, to get the riches out of Congo and out of Zambia through Angola into the Western Hemisphere. So what's happening now is revived the Lobito Corridor. And well, there's a lot of nice talk around it. But the effect is that the new riches that are still underground in Congo and Zambia and Angola need to come to the western side and not to the eastern side of Africa. And so, and this is recent. So if you look at those kind of developments, I think they are, if you look like Saskia Sassen tries to do, then you can see how the world economy developed in such a way that it's still, it's not the same as 100 years ago. It changed and it developed, but the effect is still the same.
It's interesting that it's called denational because in many ways what it strikes me is in fact the importance of the nation state to that framework, because it's actually precisely because there was a nation state with a capital city where organizations, Western institutions can go in and make those deals, that enables the structure. So I'm quite interested by the Kurdish writer Abdullah Öcalan, who favours obviously Kurdistan is an interesting case of a region with no nation state, which has been after the after effects of the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the British and French mandates and so on. But in that situation, he favours something called democratic confederalism, and he, after many years of struggle, believes that the nation state is the problem. The nation state actually structures frameworks where, which has already argued in 1972, the alliance of African and European elites at the expense of the African poor, and I think it's the second half of that dynamic which wasn't really focused on in the discussion so far. But I think it clearly is the case, therefore, that reflecting on Angola as being required us also to problematize the nation state. And you know, look at Mozambique, for example. I mean, Mozambique is such an enormous country. The structures of the state are always going to favour a concentration of power and try and control it. And so I think Öcalan's ideas are very relevant.
Well, it's worthwhile anyhow to try to develop that new framework you mentioned, because we're all lacking the kind of framework that brings all our interventions together, which may be impossible. It's not always possible to bring all the interventions together. If I see the example of the Lobito corridor, we could also start investigating, looking into, studying, because the Benguela Railroad, there is some short-lived history to that, was effectively, to a great part, developed and also repaired by the Chinese. So now, in the time of Eduardo dos Santos. So now we have João Lourenço, who has effectively kicked out the Chinese from that Lobito corridor and took in the Americans and the European countries, Europe. So that's an interesting way of how you could look at what Angola as a independent country is doing in this kind of framework of this total well, economic effect, globalization time. And I think here things could come together at a certain moment, because it's certain that Angola has its own way of developing things. And it's also certain, in my view, so that's what I like in Patrick Chabal, for instance, how he described how Africa works. But Africa does not work in a void. It works in a situation where all these things are coming together. And I think we simply still lack the overarching framework for that. So it's now up to you. I'm getting too old for it.
I think Carlos Lopez's book is a good one on that one.
Yeah, well, let me say something else. Well, it's not that the elites are the ones to be blamed, or the book is not about that. As a matter of fact, as I said, the story is much more complex. The relationship between so-called rulers and so-called ruled is much more complex, and also Chabal was one of the first mentioned, but not Chabal even. There were also Bayat, Meda. A lot of them also talked about those interconnections between the people. But it brings me to, and that discussion is much older. If you go back to the 50s, if we go back to Nkrumah, if we go back to Sékou Touré, if we go back to Jules Nyerere. So by then, the discussion between the so-called Monrovia group and the so-called Casablanca group also brought that problem into the table. And the so-called governing elites by then were faced with this challenge. Either we go for some kind of a federalist type of government, that what in fact Africa needed by then, because as you mentioned the Lobito corridor, I mean, the whole design of these countries was from an outward perspective, from an extractive perspective. Railroads, ports, everything was meant to be made for extraversion. So these economies are extremely poorly diversified, for one thing, and they are extremely extroverted. So of course, by then there was a need for a different logic, a logic of centripetal logic, okay, not a centrifugal outside, but a centripetal logic, and that was the project of the Pan-Africanists, that was the project of the Federalists, that was the project of Casablanca group. But the Monrovia group somehow, that we would say would be a far right position, an extreme right position. They said, no, that is a problem, that is a big problem. We are at start, we have a nation to be built. And they became a lot stronger than the other group, and they won. And so the project that won inside the African Union, the organization, African Unity, the project that won, and in the chart of the organization, it's clearly said we will leave the borders as left by the colonialists, period. And then we will see in the future if we can build the United States of Africa. It's still in the African Union chart nowadays. So, but it was some kind of a concession, a diplomatic concession to the Casablanca group and to the Federalists and to the Pan-Africanists. So, and the problem is still there. The problem is still there. So the pragmatic nationalistic current that was followed then by this Monrovia group, the nationalists of Boigny on one side, and on all the other elites that were very well connected to the Western world, and the option was that option. Of course, it was not. Let us say, well, as a matter of fact, there was no real option because there was not much space left for an effective, because the federalist option would imply that you have common structures, that you need some kind of institutions that are focused in in creating barriers to the outside in order to promote domestic trade between the countries, in order to launch other type of infrastructures that would connect these economies. So the whole thing that the European Union did in terms of integrating economies, integrating institutions, in order to defend a space of economic development. In other words, a real revolution of what was on the ground in terms of nation states, or what would become new nation states. And that was, in fact, it was very difficult to get all these elites to come together and to accept the project and all the costs that project would imply. It would imply to go to the West and negotiate as a common front all these concessions that had to be made. These economies were extroverted; they were still very dependent on these markets on the West, despite of the decolonization. So I do agree with you. The independence was more formal than anything else. We still lack a real independence, the economic independence. Someone that was participating in our group, and we dedicated this book to him, Luis Araújo, usually said in Angola, and you work with the most poor neighborhoods in Angola, and live there. And he always said, well, the only thing we decolonized was the land, and even that was not decolonized. He said, so it was a fake decolonization, a fake independence. We are still dependent. We are not saying that, well, it is easy to blame the elites, as you say, but it's much more complex. We have all these international constraints that effectively limited the options these elites have, although, and we had from guys as Mobutu, that was a crook, to guys that were very honest, like Julius Nyerere, and very respectful, even Nkrumah, in my opinion, or Sékou Touré. These were guys that were honest. We don't know any case of corruption of Julius Nyerere. He ended up poor in the end. Nkrumah, the same. So we had guys that were genuinely interested. So we cannot talk about the elites as a group of corrupt people that were there and that took over the colonial state for their profit and so on and so forth. That is the simple version, and the simplistic version, and the Manichaeist version. But it's not true. Of course, you had a lot of different kind of elites. But in the end, all of them ended up to embrace this nation-state project, adopting some kind of official management, be it socialism, be it liberal capitalism. But in the end, and that is one of the theses of Chaval, in the end, these systems under these guise of socialism or liberal capitalism, under that disguise, there was a certain way of doing things that were very similar in.
Can I just comment? I taught this today, actually, and Lydia was here on the bus, about the alternative that independence was the Federal Federation. Of course, East African Federation was on the table, but Kenyatta was effectively bought off by the British. That's quite widely known. And a year after that, the law not to repossess any of the white settler farms in Kenya. So that's where the interaction with the global framework has to.
There's stories everywhere. I mean, there was no alternative, and we know that. As there is no alternative today.
Oh, come on. There must be an alternative.
Just read Carlos Lopes. This is published this
I know Carlos Lopes is a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine.
A person who is in enough meetings to be frustrated about the fact that there is no alternative. It's not that it can't be, but as we speak, there is no alternative. There's no alternative in the UK.
I believe that there might be an alternative, and as Malin used to say, education will be the alternative and we can no longer comply with systems that systematically have been destroying the educational system. And once again, they are replicating, and increasing the same practices of the colonialism, which is not to give education to people, destruct the public system of education, destruct the public system of health.
Again, I would just point out that this is happening. This is happening in the UK.
One in
So it
three
is a
children
good,
in
but
the
here,
UK live in poverty. One in three.
But here you still have some institutions that are able to protect that kind of activism and that kind of those
that's why I think the global framework is so important. Because actually, one of our colleagues, Rita, has done quite a lot of work on how a lot of the things which are trialed in the global south are eventually then rolled out in the global north. So, for example, the assault on education since the 1980s in African universities is now being rolled out in the global north. The example you can easily think of is cashless society in India. India had the abolition of cash effectively by Modi in 2018, and then COVID came along and we saw a similar process happening. So these processes are very interconnected, and that's why we think globally about it.
Well, we are all from the dependentist and world system school, so we clearly know what you are talking about.
Yeah.
But even so, and I used to be called a pessimist, huh? I would say that.
So you're overhauled.
But anyway, I just think that one of the reasons, I want to believe this, one of the reasons why Trump in the end was not very successful in his first administration was that was because of this separation of powers and strong institutions that somehow in the limit managed to sustain his ability to control everything. I'm not sure if it's going to happen now. But anyway, but I think that was the case. In Angola and Mozambique, you have a complete mesh between superposition between the executive, legislative, and judicial, and the president rules all, and the party is everywhere, and so there is a complete mix, and it's difficult for you. How can you and if you control the elections, as in Mozambique and in Angola, of course, and if you control the elections, and if you control the results, and that was one of the main discussions we had in Angola in the last conference, and also in Portugal with all these youngsters and the activists, rappers and hip hoppers and so on and so on, and they are aware of this. They are aware of this, and they point the finger to the opposition party, and they say, "You are part of this fake democracy because you want to participate in elections that you know at start that you will lose." And you said to us in Angola, you said to us, "No, this time will be different, and we'll go up to the last consequences, and we'll defend for your votes. Believe." And people believed, and the end result, and then they asked, "Well, so you said what were the last consequences? To go again to the Supreme Court?" We did that in 2017, 2012. Nothing happened. Is that it? What you meant? No, because you want to avoid the bloodbath and so on and so forth, blah, 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 blah. And they said, "We have nothing more to wait for. We want a bloodbath if necessary, because we are tired of living like this." And that's what is happening in Mozambique right now. I mean, these people is despair. Okay? And because of what? Because you control everything. It's not possible. You control the media, you control the economy, you control the courts, you control everything. How can you change if you don't have any institution that is minimally independent in order to? So I still believe it's possible, but of course you cannot do it with a population that doesn't have any access to school for the last 20 years, 30 years, 40 years.
And we are challenging those very institutions here. Now we are against the courts. You know? That's what the right-wing political parties are encouraging you to do, to hate on the judges that are there to upload. So if you have very entrenched democratic systems, fundamentally challenging institutions that you wouldn't think would be challenged, now how do you have the incentive to create them in places that are much more volatile? The entire system, you have rich people who are making sure that systems continue to be the way it is. And if you can challenge that in the US, now how can you have the foundations to build that in a place that doesn't have it? It's just the whole standards are going down. And I think it's very hopeful to think that we are going to do that in countries where there's just, I mean, it's so volatile. And I don't think the problem is a question of education. I think it goes beyond that. If people don't have hope, look at what we're doing in the Sahel. People are going to the streets to support.
I mean, Alexa and I, when we went to northern Mozambique in 2019, I mean, the monthly salary for a domestic help was $8.
Yes, I mean, Angola to that.
All except Cape Verde, where education standards are going up, health standards are going up, standard of living is going up from a low basis, of course, but it's going up. It's going up through good government.
But it goes back to those same conversations around how are we measuring these standards, right? Mm-hmm. Because your average Cape Verdean cannot go to the hospital. I always tell my family, if you're sick, go to the airport. If you are unwell in Cape Verde, run to the airport. That's what I would do. So I don't know. Standards, it depends on how we measure. And what about the average Cape Verdean will not tell you those standards are going up. The average Cape Verdean will tell you that Cape Verde is a cemetery for youth talent. The majority of the population is under 35, and yet is considered to be a cemetery for youth talent. This is the hope of Africa. Yeah. God help us.
But you have to look at the trajectory of what it's
on a
journey towards.
A country of 500,000 people, a handful of people, and they cannot manage. A handful.
I mean, like, look here, you've got the NHS, you're paying taxes, but look at waiting lists. I mean, isn't this supposed to be like one of the world superpowers? Yeah, I pay my taxes, but I'm still dealing with the same medical problem from 2 years ago, not being able to see a specialist, yet I'm paying taxes, yet I'm a...
And that's what we hope is going to happen in our countries, that soon you're going to be able to get this. But the standards are deteriorating. And I like to believe so. I like to believe things are getting better, but I spend a lot of time interviewing young Africans. You know, whether I'm in Kenya or I'm in Malawi or I'm in Cape Verde, and I don't hear this positive story we want to believe in. So I'm sorry, but I just, as a young African, I'm really sorry.
But you cannot tell to these young people, okay, so there's no hope, just suicide yourself.
No, I don't tell them anything. I hope they tell me.
They believe, they want to change things.
They live the experience every day.
Give them the opportunity to change.
Yeah, but where is that opportunity coming?
I mean, that's an important point. You know, the problem with Western academia when it comes to these issues is that, you know, there is an understandable desire not to emphasize negative stories, given the history of negative stories in Western academia about Africa. But that means that people are very wary of calling out actual problems, neo-colonial problems, and problems of all kinds of problems, which are simply, you know, like, you know, the work up on the COVID pandemic, nobody wants to talk about it because it's uncomfortable. It's not good enough. You know, we have to be able to talk about problems as they are, and that's not happening.
And you are talking about problems with the elites. Yes, those problems are there. We are thinking about solutions.
You want to say something?
Yeah, maybe I should. But first of all, I would like to thank the discussant and both of you for your interventions. I share the discomfort with my fellow colleagues at the table when I saw the announcement who is presenting, because I felt it's not any longer the time where predominantly elderly and all of the white men should talk, even if they have decades of experience and engagement in the regions they are analyzing and talking about. So I felt very uncomfortable, and the discussion that was provoked by your interventions made me leave a bit more relieved this meeting, I must say. So for that, thank you very much. But I'm still also having a certain discomfort about the way that discussion went. I like a very flippant remark that Mahmoud Mamdani once in a panel debate said, because he said, the only post-colonial I know is the post office. And I think that's exactly the point. And you're absolutely right by describing something which I would classify as a pact among elites. It is a global system. And the dividing line is not north and south. It's bottom and top in each and every society. But having said that, I still take the liberty, coming from Namibia, having been for 50 years a member of the former liberation, which is now the government, that we failed the people. So I'm not shying away from blaming the elites for what they actually are responsible for. It's no excuse to put the blame on apartheid if Namibia and South Africa remain the two most unequal societies in the world when it comes to the distribution of wealth. And it's not good enough to blame the North or the capitalist exploitation for that. In rent-seeking capitalist systems, in the absence of anything which would qualify as a patriotic bourgeoisie, where you generate profits to reinvest them, if only for creating new opportunities of exploitation, but by doing that, creating employment opportunities and investing in human resources. All of that is not happening. So it's a sell-out strategy for which only in parts one can blame external capitalist interests, because it's the local sell-out elite which is not investing in money generated. They are entrepreneurs. They benefit from selling mining licenses. They transfer the money abroad into bank accounts or go shopping to Dubai. And that's a significant difference to an earlier capitalist development in the industrialization processes in European countries. And it's not good enough only to say, well, that was a different time and a different trajectory and a different history. You can't expect that. I do expect that from my fellow comrades. They betrayed the people. We betrayed them. There are people in Namibia today and in South Africa, they say we were better off under apartheid. That's the ultimate defeat. And I take the liberty to put the blame on these local elites. And I've been part of such a local elite. And I think that is something we need to really openly discuss. It's not an excuse for the global exploitation. Absolutely not. But we should not actually use it as an excuse. And one final observation on the reference made to China. They haven't changed the game. They have engaged in the very same unequal exchange patterns. The trade relations have not significantly changed when you engage with China. They have an interest to get a foot into the door since the turn of the century. They made significant investments, contrasting with Western investments in infrastructure. But they came with their own agenda.
Yeah, but who created that system?
Resource exploitation. And in Namibia, where you have quite a number of Chinese who were allowed to leave China, to make a living in Namibia, they are much more resented and hated than the whites. Because their experiences, they are worse than the whites. They really compete with us on the pavement.
Yeah.
So, no, but it's just to be aware that what we are witnessing with China, it's not an alternative. It's more of the same. They are more sophisticated in the sense that they offer the red carpet for the black elites and say, we don't criticize you because we don't interfere in your domestic affairs. So if you're corrupt, we're not interested.
I mean, I think I agree with you up to quite a point, because it certainly is true that the economic dynamics are very similar. And in fact, in many ways, in some cases, for example, fishing extraction works. But I think what I would agree with said that they do build stuff. You know, they build bridges, they build infrastructure which hasn't been built by the previous.
That's what I said. I said that was the difference to the Europeans with their conditionality. The Chinese came in. You wanted a soccer stadium. That was how they started because they knew how popular soccer stadiums, and they built them as a gift. That was their entry point. Yes, that was an investment. Absolutely, they were much more able to read how to engage with African elites than the Europeans lecturing all the time and pretending to have the moral high ground.
Different relation, like the South-South relation. And I mean, we are having those discussions more broadly on the international government.
But the point is still,
South-South relations have increased because people want different terms of.
Yeah.
I understand that, but
Yes.
at the same time, the Benguela Railroad was prepared by the Chinese in a scheme of $2 billion, which was called oil for rail. So the rail went into the Benguela Railway and the oil went to China.
Yeah, but at least they don't call it charity. For me, that's
No.
They say Chinese mutual cooperation.
I know some people in Angola from the so-called elite now, who like the Chinese exactly because you are level with them and they don't take the moral high ground. I understand that, but the game is the same in the end.
But at least they don't call it charity. At least you know what you get. It's what's really the thing. I appreciate.
And then have a claim to help as well. That's the thing. You're saying it's mutually beneficial.
Whereas the West goes and sells charity, but it's still taking.
Yeah, they act like they're altruistic, but there's full of ulterior motives. And they frame it as aid, when in my opinion, it should be reparations because you forced these countries to be in the situation they are right now. So
It's indeed incredibly difficult because I have detested all my life the Western kind of colonization and the way imperialism works in the end. But even at some stage, I had hopes for China from time ago. And now you see that the same is happening.
well, it's operating on the same system as everyone
Because
else.
they're all participating in the same system. But on the other hand, I don't believe you're right that there's no alternative. The alternative will come, only we don't know. And I think that's the thing. We don't know the alternative yet, but it will grow. It may be a revolution, it may be anything else, but people will not accept it.
I agree on that.
may I just add one final thing? I think it's as relevant today as it was more than 60 years ago. Amilcar Cabral was speaking in the newly established France Fanon Center in Milano. And he was asked by the solidarity movement there, what is the best form of our solidarity with your struggle? He said, the best form of solidarity is that you are taking the fight in your own country. And that relates to what you said with your reference to what is going on in the UK, and you could add any other Western European, any other country. Pick up the fight in your own country, being aware that people in each and every other country pick up the fights. That's the best form of solidarity.
Hopefully.
And there's a lot to be done.
There's a lot today, though. You're the only person. There's a lot.
Middle old age.
Very old.
Wisdom. Wisdom.
There's a lot to be done here.
Okay, I think we have to stop here. Thank you so much for being here. As for the participants of this book, I must say that you are the ones who are left to write in English. Most of the researchers based in Angola and Mozambique wrote in Portuguese. They are here. So you are the ones who left to write in English. So that's why you are in this book. I could not change the way people want to write. So, okay, thank you so much for your participation. Thank you, Toby, for having this conversation here. Thank you for
thank you for everybody. I think it was a very good conversation, which is rarely had. So.